I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation with KB Brookins. You may know them as a poet or an artist or a cultural worker out of Texas, possibly also now the author of Pretty, a memoir, which reminds me quite a lot actually of Heavy by Kiese Laymon, which was a Discover Great New Writers pick back in the day. And KB, it's such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat today.
So I got to ask, can we start with the title? I mean, you and I were talking a little bit before we started recording, and you know where I'm coming from on this, but I think the title is really going to get people's attention. So can we start there?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So title, fun. So when I actually got this book and started writing it and sent it to my agent, it had like a totally different title. Something like Black Trans Masculine, right? Because I was like, this is a placeholder. I know it's not going to end up being the title, but these are kind of the themes that I know that I'm thinking of as writing into these pieces. And then I started writing the pieces and finishing them with my editor, Errol McDonald at Knopf. And then I think I was thinking of like different methods of titling, right? And one common method of titling when you have like a book that has multiple chapters with different titles, as I do, is like, oh, maybe one of the titles of a chapter can be the title of the book. And I kind of landed on this chapter that I have in a book called Pretty, right? Yeah. Pretty is a piece in the book that I think is pretty indicative of like what to expect from the book. I'm talking a lot about masculinity, critiquing masculinity even, and fully trying to embrace it as a Black trans and masculine person, and trying to figure out, through, my failures and through like interactions that I've had with others, like what does it mean to be masculine, right? The book also does a thing where I oscillate between prose and poetry, and in that piece in particular, I'm doing that. So I was like, okay, this also like introduces people to that. Cause you put a book in order, right? And you're like, well, this is the order that I'd like you to read in. But like a lot of people I've heard, like when they see a title, right, they look through the table of contents and they see the titular piece. Sometimes that's the first piece that they read. So I was like, okay, if this is the first thing that someone reads, like, what will they learn about the book? Right. So I landed on that. And then it's also like doing a thing that I think is like upending like an expectation of a book about masculinity. In the sense that I'm talking about, and putting masculinity and prettiness and beauty and gorgeousness like right next to each other. And talking about like, well, why do we feel like, those things can't exist in the same sentence, can't exist in the kind of culture of masculinity that we've created.
When did you start writing the pieces that ultimately became Pretty?
I wrote them after probably months of writing some, not good poems. So
okay.
I finished my book, Freedom House, which came out last year as a poetry book. And after that, I was like, all right, what's next? And so I started writing, poems. And also I started writing poems around the same time that I was kind of looking for like literature about the trans experience, because like a year or so into the medical part of my transition, I started growing hair. My voice started dropping, like, and the way that people interacted with me in the real world started changing in some really like confusing ways for me. Like seeking out literature about that, about the trans experience, right? And then also at the same time, just like writing what I see. I kind of came across like, books like Heavy, right, by Kiese. So other books like by Hanif Abdurraqib, like all of these other writers who write about masculinity, but right, like not from a trans experience. And also when I was reading trans books, they were often not from a Black experience, right? So I was finding kind of like a hard time with like not seeing a book that is like, girl to boy, dainty to privilege, because that's not my experience of transness. Then I started, writing poems. And then I also realized like, oh, I don't even know if I need like the craft of poetry. I think I need to like pick up other craft kind of conventions in order to say what I mean. So then I started writing these, what at the time I was like essays, right? Started placing those in some places like HuffPost, like Teen Vogue, X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh, well, I kind of didn't realize, but I think these are connected. So I started connecting them. And then it became a book. Like, I don't know if it happened pretty organically of like writing my experience. But then I was like, oh, now I feel a kind of mission to like write this experience into literature that I'm not seeing.
In a way, you're still explaining yourself
Right.
on the page. I'm going to make an assumption, and obviously correct me if I'm not right, but that there is a freedom to doing it in a book like this compared to walking around in the world, right? And especially, I mean, you have never quite fit into gender norms after adolescence, from what I can tell from the book, that you've just sort of, you've always had your own sense of style. You've always had your own sense of presence. You've had a lot of systems, both school and church, sort of look at you and say, excuse us.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you feel having the book out in the world now? And it's because it is a little different from putting poetry out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, with a memoir, you have to say like this happened. Whereas
Right.
like, in a poem, you can say like, oh, the I is not necessarily me, right? And
Right.
I'm putting on a persona, or like maybe it's like a close third to me, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
I'm here and the poem is here, kind of thing. But yeah, with a memoir, right? Even though you say creative nonfiction and like it's not an autobiography, it still is very much like a this happened. And I think my experience really of it is, I guess, just like I feel kind of like an exhale. I was, very nervous about it because often, like when I'm explaining gender identity stuff and how my gender identity is not the same as, but like, next to, because a lot of people conflate like gender and sexual orientation
Right.
and talking about those things, it's often hard for me to like get to a place of understanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
With this book, I'm like, well, you can read it and you can reread it, and I'm not like right next to you, right, telling you the answer. Like you discover the answer on your own. It's been freeing because I wrote the things down as like an archival method at first, just like
Right.
this is what the days are like. Often you see, right, trans people do a version of this online, right, where it's like, oh, this is my voice one day on T, or this is my voice one week on T, and you're kind of chronicling those kind of, you know, the ways that your body is changing. And the way I naturally, because I'm a writer, was chronicling those changes is just through prose, right? And through poetry and letting those things kind of exist on the page as if to say, like, this is my experience. Like, do you understand? So I hope that, putting out a book like this, even in the moments where I'm like, I'm scared people will still not understand. I hope that it'll lead to people interrogating the ways that they just kind of like assign gender to things very quickly. I start the book literally in like a we are gendered before we are even born,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like it's a girl. As soon as you hear that, right, you start to think of clothes. You start to think of these things for this, girl, right, that you're about to have when you're hopeful parents and people around you, right, are getting excited about these like expectations that a person is supposed to fit, right? But what about when they don't fit? Right?
Mm.
I think like this book is kind of exploring that. What about when they don't fit? And then also like, what about when you fit into a gender presentation, but it's not the one that you actually see for yourself, right?
Right.
There's a maleness now ascribed to me that doesn't necessarily fit like how I identify. So, I feel like, okay, this is not just mine now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping. I mean, I see, book writing and publishing a book as like me communicating with a contributor.
Can we go back to something you just said for a second? Because you are interrogating masculinity
Yeah.
in a lot of different ways. You have your adoptive dad, you have your bio dad, you have the friends you made in high school and college. And so you have sort of ideas of masculinity in sort of conventional sense. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
You're still figuring it out on your own. And yet it's not all of you.
Hmm.
And I thought that was really interesting because at first, and I told you this earlier before we started taping, that I had read the book blind the first time and I sort of didn't quite know. I knew I liked some of the poetry I'd seen and I was like, let's dig around. Let's see what's going on here. And it turns out I like your prose quite a lot too. But watching you sort through that, and I have quite a lot of compassion for you as a young person, because there was an awful lot you didn't know, and you didn't have people around you who could show you a different way.
Right.
You know, your parents love you, but they were a little confused. And they sound like they were older when I mean, they were not young people when you showed up. So I think you've got some generational stuff happening. And also your parents, I don't know, would you describe your parents for listeners?
Yeah. So I first, right, like, my bio mother was 17 and she got pregnant with me, 18 when I was born. And then it became pretty apparent in the first, like, kind of 2 years of my life, like, she can't really keep up, quote unquote.
Right.
So then I got adopted by these folks who were in their 40s, right, in their early 40s when I was 2 years old, right? So I definitely agree with, like, there are just generational gaps, right? And like speaking across generations and also speaking across like different like expectations. 'Cause my family is also very religious. So with kind of like religion being like a part of both sides of my adopted family, there was a lot of expectation of like being a good church girl, basically. Right? You are not to, sit with your legs open. You are not to, right, like put yourself in any kind of situation where anyone would think badly about you. Because then they would think badly about the whole family, right? Like I also lived in a town where like, all of my family was around. So even if I like if I'm like go to the movies as a teenager, okay, at the next, family reunion, maybe my cousin is gonna bring up that he saw me cursing there, you know?
Yeah. No,
But
it's a fishbowl. You lived in a fishbowl,
yeah,
is what it sounds like.
absolutely.
You lived in a very specific part of town, right? And that's sort of where everything happened. And that was the entirety of Fort Worth. Is that everyone sort of kept to their corners, it sounds like. I mean, I don't obviously know Fort Worth well. I've been through Dallas and Houston and Austin, but Fort Worth sort of, I don't know how I've missed it, but I have.
Yeah, it's its own world, at least the Fort Worth that I like grew up in. It's definitely changing, right?
Okay.
Now that I'm older, but yeah, I lived in Stop Six, which is a specific neighborhood on the east side of Fort Worth, a number of miles big, and it was where like my family lived on one street, and then like two streets over, my uncle lived on that street, and then a couple doors down, another uncle lived there, and like we were very in Stop Six, and it's like the historical like black part of town.
You also have to find new community, though.
Right.
I mean, your family is all there, this entire setup, school, church, everything, all within this sort of very specific radius of Fort Worth. And you talk about it a bit in the book, and obviously I'm not going to give away spoilers. I really want people to be able to sit with the work and sit with you the way I got to. But I have so much compassion for you as a young person trying to figure out how to map what comes next. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about building a new community, because you do, in a way, have to pitch forward, right? You have to move forward and figure out what's next. But again, the resources aren't necessarily there. There aren't, giant textbooks on how to do this kind of thing. How do you build community in a way that ultimately works for you as KB?
The book starts in Fort Worth, and then it kind of moves to Austin, which is where I live now, where I've lived throughout my 20s, right?
Okay.
And that move came very randomly. I had a friend who was moving to Austin, and I was like, "Can I move with you?" Because I was just really ready to leave. Like I had been from 0 years old to 21, because I also went to Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. So I was just ready to do something new. So I moved to Austin, and I also moved like fresh out of a relationship, right? Relationship that's talked about at length in the titular kind of. Then all of a sudden, I didn't have eyes on me in the same way. And also all of a sudden, I had to figure out how to be a queer adult after not really getting the space to be a queer youth, or at least not in the way that I wanted to. So essentially, like how I forged forge forward from that experience, from the experience of being in Fort Worth, I think was just, I don't know, messing up sometimes, right? Like I have a piece in the book called "You Just Haven't Met the Right Guy," right?
Right.
Me kind of doing a whole social experiment to kind of figure out whether or not I'm a lesbian or whatever. And it's like I wrote about that and like put it in the book because it feels like almost shameful, quote unquote, like once you've like decided on a sexuality to then change. I'm
Right.
like, I don't know. As I talk to other people, right, as I have, especially since I moved to Austin, like it's not that uncommon, right? Feel like because you have a certain gender presentation that you can only be a certain sexuality, right? Like it's like projected onto butch lesbians, right? Where it's like, well, you dress butch, so of course you're a lesbian, right? Yeah, I mean, I think I did a lot of experimentation and then also a lot of intentionally putting myself out there and going to queer spaces and really finding like-minded people. Now these days, like I never have to question whether or not, one of my friends gets it, right? I don't ever have to question like whether or not I'm safe, right? Amongst my friends. Like even if the world is doing whatever, I live in Texas. So Texas politics, right? Not the most nice, not the most welcoming to trans and Black people, but surely there are Black trans people here, and we make do with what we can by finding each other.
You have a particularly great essay where you talk about resiliency a lot, right? And resilience is a word that kind of bugs me a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it's something that we ascribe to a certain segment of the population, and it's supposed to be a compliment.
Right.
Like, look at how resilient you are. And instead of looking at the system that forces people to be resilient in the face of stuff that's deeply unpleasant that other people might not have to experience, right? We really do sort of swing it around like it's a good thing. And I want to parse that word with you for a second, because especially when you're Black and trans in America, that seems to get sort of pinned to you in a way that it doesn't necessarily get pinned on other communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we know statistics, right? Like the life expectancy for trans people of color is something like 35, right?
Yeah.
Some people are just like, you're walking around, you're alive, right? Like, shout out to you for being so resilient, right? Like, yeah, I feel the same way in the sense of like, I actually think, putting resiliency officers in cities and in schools and XYZ, I'm like, well, you could also change the conditions so people are not forced to be resilient, right?
Right.
Set up systems to where like we don't start at a deficit, right? And we have to endure. Like I don't have to, write this piece about going to the gynecologist and all of the roadblocks that are in place just to do something that, a cisgender straight woman can do very easily, right? And let me revise that: a cisgender straight white woman, right, can do very easily. There are, lots of statistics out there about like Black women and mortality rates and things like that. There are moments in this book, right, that I allow myself to be angry, right? I think there's real like aversion to like, being angry on the page or like seeming preachy, right? But I'm like, I don't know. There are certain authors that are allowed, authors without my identities that are allowed to be angry. And then when someone like me is angry, then it's like prescribed all of these kind of like negative qualities, right? And like when you critique something like resiliency, it's like, well, we're trying to help. And I'm like, no, you're not actually trying to help by like doing something so reactive, like, putting systems in place to combat or like to address resiliency. It's like, no, I actually would rather not deal with something and then you come afterwards and tell me, right, that you're helping me. It's like, no, you could have helped me all of these years ago.
And also anger. I mean, this brings me back again to Heavy, Kiese Laymon's memoir. I don't think your anger is out of place in the narrative either. I mean, obviously we can't separate it from your experience and we shouldn't try to separate it from your experience. But in terms of a literary device, right, because Pretty is a memoir, you get some license, right, that maybe an autobiography or, down the road someone does biography of you. There's less of that room, right? Yeah. And the idea that we get a real 360 of you as KB the artist and the writer and the cultural and the human being, right? Like we get this complete portrait. Like there's some real moments of joy. And I mean, it's a complete portrait. And I'm wondering too, if we can talk about sort of what's bringing you joy now, because we can't, as much as you can't cut out the anger and pretend it's not there, you also can't really live a life without some sort of pleasure, right? And some sort of enjoyment or joy.
It's very necessary. And I mean, I find joy in moments I think people think like, oh, this space is devoid of it. We're living in a moment right now where lots of college students just weeks ago like did lots of protests. They've been called, pro-Palestine protests to protest their institutions, right? Having in Israel who is partaking in a genocide against Palestine, right? And I think, it was a lot of long nights, right? I live in Austin, at the University of Texas at Austin in particular. Like we had a couple of protests that made kind of national news. I was on campus both times that we had protests, and people I knew, right? That I had classes with, people that I, had their numbers, right? Like got arrested and things like that. And even within those moments, right, there's joy in seeing a friend, at a protest that I haven't seen in a while. And I'm like, oh, how are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. Right. It's joy in the moments of like sharing resources, sharing food, right? Being able to bring water for someone to relieve them of the, blaring heat that we have here in our state to have due to the summer. There is real joy in like an act of imagining a better world with other people. So that does bring me joy, even amongst like the weariness that is seeped in, right? Organizing with others, being around other people who have the same values as you, who you love, I think is joyous, right? Another thing that's been bringing me joy really is like, I've been reading a lot, right? A good thing to distract yourself from a book coming out and not like stressing out too much. Right? It's like reading. So I've been reading some books that I really loved. I just read a short story collection called Dearborn that I really liked. I'm reading a book called Cactus Country by Zoe Bossier, who I had a couple of events with in the Portland area in a couple of weeks. And I also recently read Fatty Judah's new book that I really enjoyed. So just reading, getting in somebody else's head, seeing what decisions they make, it makes you feel less, or at least it makes me feel less self-conscious about my decisions and like how it may not be perceived.
Well, can we talk to you a little bit about the editorial process? I mean, you do have an agent. I don't know how much your agent participates in editorial decisions before you start working with someone like Errol, your editor. But I mean, it's still your life story. It's still your experience. It's very personal, and yet you do have to trust that outsiders can help you shape the story. And am I correct in saying you don't have a formal background in writing? Right? You haven't. You've been writing. Don't misunderstand me, but like you don't actually just have a piece of paper that says you did a course and it's done, kind of thing. That's not your experience of how you learned your craft.
Not so far. I mean, I'm technically in an MFA right now, but like, that wasn't the case when I wrote the book. So reading, like the way that I learned, writing, mostly up until now was reading other people, having other people who I trusted read my stuff, get back, like very community oriented stuff.
Yeah. I mean, part of the fun for me as I was putting together sort of my notes for this show is, you've also talked about Safiya Sinclair and How to Save Babylon, which is a memoir I really love, and also ZZ Packer, Drinking Coffee Elsewhere, great story collection. If you haven't read it, go back, find it. But then also Bell Hooks popped in another, and We Real Cool, and Brian Broom also cited that as an influence for him when he was writing his memoir, Punch Me Up to the Gods. So I like seeing these intersections of culture that you clearly pull from in a lot of different ways. And certainly like the way Safiya talks about masculinity in Rastafari culture and whatnot, but also she does talk about the joy in writing, and she does talk about what she found in poetry and what she was able to create for herself. All of them make sense to me in the context of what I now know about you and your memoir and your poetry collections and whatnot. But do you think going forward you're going to keep mixing poetry and prose, or do you want to just sort of bounce back and forth between the two? I mean, it was Good Grief that was published on the Academy of American Poets website, and it got a lot of attention. And I think a lot of folks do know you from that particular poem. But what do you think your creative future looks like?
Oh man, good question. So I'm like, who knows? I mean, in this book, it's interesting bringing up, the oscillation between prose and poetry. That's something that I really set out to do when I sold the book to Knopf. It was a thing actually suggested to me because I was trying to do this thing, right, where I was like, kind of like not reverse engineering, but trying to make a poem into a prose piece, right? Because I started, right, these thoughts, these ideas with just poems. And then I was like, I feel like I can't do this. So now I'm going to do prose, right? But my editor, Errol, was like, well, these poems can actually, the ones that you deem successful and the ones that don't, feel like something that you're already saying or already covering in the prose pieces of this can just also be in the book, right?
Right.
I feel like the poems in the book are kind of just like their own separate entity from the prose. Like these are ideas that I felt like, oh, why don't I just preserve them in poetry rather than trying to make the poem into a prose piece, right?
Yep.
So yeah, that was a thing that happened kind of later. And the future of my work, I mean, I don't know, I'm a very curious writer, just like I'm a curious reader. Like I read fiction, I read nonfiction, I read poetry, read, YA. I'm trying to get into, anime. Oh my God, like I love Megan Thee Stallion, right? Trying to understand her more, so I'm trying to get into anime and manga and stuff like that. But yeah, like I'm a very curious reader, and when I read things, in maybe genres that I don't necessarily work in, like I feel very enticed by it, and I'm like, the best mechanism to keep me writing actually has been like reading other people's stuff and being like, I want to do that, but I want to do that in my own way. Right. So, there might be like a novel in the future. There might be a short collection in the future. Like I'm keeping my options kind of open. As far as like mixing prose and poetry together, a bucket list thing for me definitely is just like writing a straight up prose book, which I think I will at some point.
When you're reading, it sounds like you read for voice first, like it's character and voice, and that's the thing. I mean, just thinking about what I've read of Dearborn, I haven't finished it yet because sometimes you don't get all of the time to read all of the things that you want to read when you want to read them. But the stories I've read are pretty terrific. But I do feel like you're reading for voice first. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. As a reader and also hopefully as a writer, like I want the voice to like pick up off the page.
When did you know you'd had the voice for Pretty, though? I mean, again, you're working off of your notes of your experience, but creating a narrative voice is a totally different thing, right? It takes discipline. It takes a little bit of muscle. It takes a lot of thought. It also takes a willingness to take edits from someone who is not you. When did you know you had the voice? I mean, was that happening as you were writing the essays that got placed earlier in like HuffPo and Teen Vogue and all of that kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm a little delusional, but I was like, I don't know. Voice is not the problem. Like, actually, for me at least, like, I see, like, really, I just wanted to learn the rules of, like, nonfiction. And I was, like, a lot focused on that. But I was like, I know how I sound. I know how to, take on, because I've done it in poetry before, like, even take on somebody else's voice that is not mine. I don't know. I'm also from like both a gospel tradition and a rap tradition, right?
Okay.
Like both of those things, right? Freestyling with my friends, in their cars and stuff in high school kind of thing. So I'm like very used to picking up a persona, all of a sudden, I'm this guy from New York. I'm Jay-Z right now, or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. Voice for me, I think with this book in particular, with Pretty, I was a lot concerned about, movement. Like, how can I create a sense of movement? And that's the thing I had to learn, right? and be okay with Arrow being like, so let's connect this a little bit more. I'm also a poet, right? So I'm like, I'll just change the subject. And then they're like, well, the thing about nonfiction is maybe need more of a transition between things. So, I had to learn a bit more about like creating a narrative and creating a sense of movement in the narrative. But the voice part, I guess I don't second guess as much.
Okay. I mean, also, when I hear you talk about gospel music and rap, my first thought is cadence. And cadence is something you really need on the page, too. Fiction or non, cadence is the thing. Like, you've read bumpy sentences, I've read bumpy sentences. They are not fun.
Yeah.
I don't need perfect sentences, but I like spiffy sentences. I really do. I'm okay if not a lot of stuff happens, but I need good sentences. And when I think of you and hear you say, well, I had to learn the rules of nonfiction, I'm like, well, cadence clearly has to be at the top of that list. Because if you don't pull someone in, right, you're just going to lose them in a sea of facts, even if they're facts about your life specifically. You're going to lose them. So what are some of the other rules of nonfiction you felt like you had to learn to create pretty?
Oh man. You're right. You're definitely right with cadence. So with a poem, right? I think my goal when I write a poem and then when I'm like, oh, this poem is publishable, I'm thinking about like, do I feel moved by it? Right. Has any kind of movement happened to where like, oh, there's some kind of thing that has changed. I think that the way that nonfiction navigates change can sometimes be different, right?
Okay.
It's like, at least in, if I talk on the granular level about something like Until I Wasn't, right, which is an early piece in the book, I'm thinking about where I started and where I ended, right? Maybe I started and ended in the same place, but something has changed, right? How do I like display that change in a narrative sense, right? Maybe like less in like a emotion sense. Surely the emotions, right, also change. But I'm thinking of just like different sensibilities around like how to put together a narrative and how to create change. So I had to learn that for sure. I had to learn also like, the prose pieces in the book are on the short side in comparison to like a writer that maybe has like a 50-page like piece. I had to get to a place of like learning a bit about like sense of closure, right?
Yeah.
Because the sense of closure in poetry is different, I think, than the sense of closure in nonfiction. Like, what's thrusting someone into the next piece? Like, I'm thinking a lot about that in nonfiction. And I'm also thinking about like maybe the piece is not like this, maybe the piece is not like this, but it can't like do this, right? Like it can't just like be
Can't be flat.
yeah,
Cannot be flat. You have to have some sense of momentum.
right. So learning that also I think is a thing I picked up while writing this book.
It does all sound like you're pulling though from music and poetry. Like again, I keep coming back to the fact that they are, I mean, it's more of a circle than a Venn diagram, right? Like you're just it's all if you don't have the rhythm, then you just get a little bit lost. I also love the fact that you open pretty with sort of an ode to Dion Brand, who's a poet I quite like. And it just made me smile. It's making me smile just thinking about it as well. Can we talk about some of the other poets that have been influences for you? Because, I mean, before you enrolled in the MFA program, you really were self-taught in a lot of ways. And I love the idea that you really just were a sponge reading everything you could get your hands on.
Absolutely. I took a couple of creative writing classes in undergrad, but you know, my I mostly was doing journalism, right?
Okay.
And I was mostly taking Black studies type of classes. So yeah, I'm like those, but yeah, mostly definitely like independent study, right? Influences for me, off the top of my head, definitely Kiese Laymon. So like people, don't consider him a poet, right? Because like he's mostly published fiction and nonfiction, but I'm like the way that he uses repetition.
Yeah, there's again, it comes back to cadence and
Right.
momentum, narrative thrust, propulsion, whatever you want to call it, and cadence. He's doing some stuff in his sentences that not every prose writer is doing. And that, I mean, for me, that's what made me sit up and pay attention.
Absolutely. It's like some of the like poetic sensibilities I can see. I love Morgan Parker. Really anything that she publishes, I will read. Particularly like I'm inspired by her use of like the grim and the humorous like to get next to each other, right? Like she's a poet that's not scared of being marked by time. There's this sense of like and teaching toward timelessness. But I'm like, no, Morgan Parker is like a 21st century poet. And she doesn't like care, right? Like she drop something from Andre 3000 in a poem. She'll drop something from like, being a millennial woman in New York in 2012 or whatever in a poem. I really love that about her poetry. Her syntax is really awesome. Really love Dinesh Smith as well. Don't Fall Is Dead was like really important for me to read while I was like, a baby poet. And seeing their move between like spoken word and like, the page, like Dinesh comes out of like that time where button poetry really like blew up and like we're kind of like making that move because like the poetry community that I started in high school was also like spoken word based, so like poets do that effectively, and like the poet is also Black and queer. Like it was meaningful to me. Yeah, there are lots of people, but let's stay with those.
Okay. Well, that's fair. I mean, the three of the best working today. I mean, Dinesh Smith, Morgan Parker, and Kiese Laymon. Like, I have no fault with any of that. I think they're all fabulous, fabulous, fabulous writers. I'm curious, though, did you feel like you needed to go get an MFA did you need the formal schooling? Or was it just, well, I have this opportunity, I may as well do it. It's kind of cool. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I got an MFA at an interesting time, right? Like in my quote unquote career, in the sense coming into it, already having a chapbook. I had a chapbook called How to Identify Yourself with a Wound that came out to started the program that same year. And I had already like gotten a deal for Freedom House and was like working on one for free. So I was like, I thought a lot about like, do I even need this, quote unquote, right? Like, and a number of my friends were also in my ear saying the same thing. I only applied to one program. Like it was at UT Austin because I was like, I don't want to move and I also don't want to pay for it. So I'm just going to apply to one program. And if it doesn't work out, like my world won't be, I won't be devastated. I ultimately decided to go, I think, because discipline, right? I'm a very deadline based writer. Having like book deals where you got to turn stuff in by a certain time, like is the reason why I was writing so consistently for like 3 years. But like after that thrust, I was like, well, what else do I have? Definitely like just getting me into a writing practice. I wanted that. Before I got into MFA, I was also like a full-time writer, whatever. And like, it sounds glamorous, but also like no healthcare, right? So there's like that kind of precariousness of life. The third thing actually was pedagogy. I enjoy teaching. I did a lot of community-based workshops, right? Taught a lot of in there and also participated in them and things like that. But it's impossible to teach at the collegiate level, right? Unless you have some kind of terminal degree. And I also wanted to try out teaching to see, right, if it's a thing that I would entertain as like a career path for me. And I've loved it, like especially when I'm like making my own syllabus, which I am gonna do in the fall. All I do now when I like read books is like maybe I'll Xerox this in the fall and like teach it, whatever. It's given me a different perspective on even things that I've like read multiple times, right? Just hearing people about it in the classroom. It really lights something for me.
Okay, KB, I really am trying to stay away from spoilers because there's a lot that happens in Pretty. But there's one thing that I realized is in my notes, and before I let you go back to your real life. The book is nonlinear, and I think that's a really important point to make because you never lose sight of the bigger themes. The voice is always really consistent, but you play with time and you play with your experience, your evolution, your changing, your transition, whatever transformation, whatever word you're most comfortable using. But I think that nonlinearity is something we should talk about before I let you go. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm down. Trauma, right? Like it manifests, at least for me, in like nonlinear ways, right? Often when you experience like childhood trauma, also like it hinders your ability to remember. And it's so interesting that I like went into this art form that like really relies on remembering, right? The memoir, and nonfiction in general. And I even just disclaim at the very beginning, like there are some things that I don't remember, but I'm giving you slices, right? And every memoir gives you slices. It's not like here's the day born and here's the day I died, right? That would be like an 800-page book, you know. But yeah, I think with me, it's very important, I think. And it was like the way that I needed to tell pretty, right? And to relate to the audience, to oscillate between different timelines, right? I do more or less start at the very beginning, right? And I do kind of end in like a close to present day. But like the things in the middle and even like within the same piece, right? Those things may change, right? Because it's current day me talking about 5-year-old me. So it's hard to like divorce myself from current day me. And I also do like lots of reflection throughout the book on like, this is how I acted in this moment. This is not how I act now, right? And it was really important to me in pieces to kind of like reflect that growth, to kind of show a reader like, just because you are this way right now doesn't mean you have to be this way in perpetuity, right? Breaking habits that don't fit, right? And like, how can I write about a book about masculinity without talking about the times that I've like maybe fallen into toxic masculinity and the ways that I kind of got out of it, right? Ways that I look back on it now. So yeah, like a nonlinear story and telling of this book, I think was really necessary for that reason. Also, I'm a poet and I really have no allegiance to time because I've like grew up in a poetic tradition where it's like, in this stanza, we're 20 years ago. And then in this stanza, we are 30 years into the future, right? I can do that because like a poetry reader, which I really hope, right, that prose readers kind of approach the page with this same generosity. Like a poetry reader is like, I'm ready to go on a journey, right? I'm ready to even be at times like lost or like divorced from like meaning in like a logic way. Maybe this makes sound sense, even if it doesn't make logic sense. And I think like, especially with a debut memoir, I'm like, well, I'm going to take some risks. You're going to be able to tell me whether or not those risks paid off. And I'm going to be okay with taking risks rather than staying in a pocket and making something that doesn't feel like it fits the story.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited for readers to meet you on the page. Pretty actually is out now. So Pretty by KB Brookins. Please pick it up this summer. I hope you have as good a time with this book as I did. And yeah, there's some moments that are uneasy, but it is, again, a really 360-degree portrait of a pretty terrific poet and writer and artist and cultural worker. Did I get everything in? I got everything in, didn't I?
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, KB.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.